Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. President Donald Trump has once again questioned whether the United States is carrying too much of NATO's defense burden, just days before alliance leaders gather for next week's summit in Ankara. Now, his comments come as Russia launches one of its largest air attacks on Kiev in weeks, and the European Union's chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, argues that words alone will not stop Moscow and tougher sanctions are needed, and Europe faces growing pressure to take greater responsibility for its own security and defense. And joining us now in the studio is Marta Prochwicz, Deputy Head of the Warsaw Office, European Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we're just a few days from this summit in Ankara, but at the same time, we had again renewed comments by President Trump, again criticizing NATO. More of the same? Is this a new message? How do we interpret the president's words?
It's definitely not a new message. I mean, it's something that we've heard even from before Donald Trump. The United States has taken on a massive burden by taking over European security and being the major shareholder in Europe. That being said, the way that the message is being relayed under Donald Trump is far more aggressive than it has been until now. And it's also worth noting that the Europeans have been tremendously increasing their defense spending throughout the last 4 years since the full-scale invasion, and with even more impetus over the last year since the NATO summit in Hague, where they pledged to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. We're definitely not there yet. And that 5% is divided into 3.5 hard defense and 1.5 into infrastructure. And on the 3.5, we actually have 3 European allies, all on the eastern flank, including Poland, who do spend that amount of money.
But at the same time, I mean, this target, I mean, you could argue it's a separate question, but Trump has repeatedly said this is his achievement, and this 5%, divided, as you said, 3.5% in hard defense. But at the same time, looking always at this interesting question, Europe has to do more, it is doing more, but at the same time, we still get critique from the president. So also, I think what you've recently argued for, how can Europe, let's say, do enough for its own defense? Is it doing enough? And what's the, let's say, the strategic secret here? Or are we on the right track? Or how do you see it?
I think that we are on the right track. I mean, whether Donald Trump criticizes Europe or not is sort of out of our control. There may be many other reasons for why he's criticizing Europeans. It seems that overall the theme of his second presidency has been criticizing Europe in all aspects. He doesn't perceive Europe as a global player. He's been very cold towards Europe when it comes to the Iran war and what he perceived as a lack of help, which in fact, if it had gone through NATO, I think the response would have been very different. So what Europeans can continue to do is think about their own security, but not just because Donald Trump is calling for them to do more for their security, but because the threat authentically is on our continent. The war in Ukraine is here next door, and Russia is evidently an aggressor threatening us with hybrid attacks constantly, which have been on the rise, and potentially even with more hybrid attacks. So it's absolutely understood by all capitals throughout Europe, because all European countries, not to the same degree, but all of them have increased their defense spending, including Spain. I don't want to go too much into that conversation, but we've seen that. So the next step is to sort of not just increase the defense spending, and this is obviously following NATO capability targets, right? We're not just buying things in order to buy them. We're actually living up to the standards that were set within NATO and buying the type of equipment that is needed within those operational plans. The next step, however, should be to try to think about the institutions through which Europe does its security. And here I personally think that it should continue to be NATO, but in a far more Europeanized way, where Europeans also have decision-making power. And at the end of this very long process, path on which we are, we should also think about having our own command and control. And since we're taking more of the burden, we should have more of the say, and not everything being decided by the Americans.
But also, as you said, not everything being decided by the Americans, renewed critique of NATO, burden sharing. I mean, even if you look at the details, it doesn't take an expert to know that what Trump is saying isn't necessarily true. But so close to the summit, does this give us any indication of his policy? Will something change? And we've already had a lot of spats with his view and what he thinks NATO is. Are we seeing something potentially at Ankara that will be, let's say, bad for the alliance, or is this too early to tell? Because he's been more vocal about this than he has in the past.
Well, we cannot rule anything out, but I think it's important to understand two things. Number one, the summit is very much a political theater done in order to try to keep the Americans on board. So that question you're asking is sort of prime and center on everybody's mind. Will he come? And when he comes, what will he do? Will he say something that to the effect of withdrawing the US or undermining the collective security that we have? Because what is at heart of the NATO alliance is the trust that we have amongst allies. And unfortunately, through his rhetoric, he's very much undermined that. But and my second point is that that's not the actual thing that's happening at NATO. That's the political theater which we're doing, showing that we're spending as much as we can going towards a credible path towards the 5%. There's going to be an actual review in 2029, and that's all done in order to try to keep Donald Trump happy. But the real story at NATO is the transition towards a more European share in NATO, which requires Europeans to think about not just the numbers, which are the headline of the summit, but also in terms of the capabilities that we need in order to have greater independence, because it's a problem if we're not operational and cannot deter and defend ourselves when we rely on an ally that is so important in terms of his shares in the alliance and undermines the alliance.
Mm-hmm. But also, as you said, like the summit is very much about political theater, about keeping Donald Trump and the Americans happy. One player, and we're sitting here right now in Poland, has been very much, and you mentioned earlier, a huge defense spender. Someone of Poland has spent much more. If we're looking at all the, let's say, reasonable evidence, Poland is spending a lot more. So also you've written about this sort of independence, various ideas of European defense. So, and we've heard things in terms of what Poland has done recently, or has been worried about American support here in this part of the world. So what is Poland's strategy in all this? And you've argued for this as well, independent European defense. So how does Poland navigate that right now coming up to the summit?
Yeah. No, it's not exactly independence, actually. It's just making sure that within the alliance, now that we are taking over more of the burden, that we also have more of a say in terms of the leadership within NATO and operational capacity. Because it's not out of the question that there could be a confrontation in which, if we call Article 5 and require the consensus of 32 allies, that maybe not all allies are on board with that. That's sort of the squaring the circle. How do we do that? And what I've argued in this paper together with other colleagues, and the paper is called Making Defense European Again, is to actually have not a new structure at all. It's based on NATO. It's just making NATO more operational at a regional level. In order for that to be possible, we need to make sure that the commanders at the local level, which have operational command and capacity over joint force commands, which are sort of the local headquarters, which execute regional plans and are the actual players on the ground, that they are more operational without needing consensus and agreement of 32 allies, which then becomes the politics of it. We don't want to avoid that. And the architecture that we've argued for is, number one, so that's an operational NATO, a more European NATO through this sub-regional trajectory. And number two, we have to make sure that the European Union is also pulled into this. And how do we do that? The European Union doesn't actually have any forces well, it does, but not the sort of forces that we could use in this operation. It doesn't have command and control, so it doesn't have the whole logistics. That it's not a defense organization. It's a funding. It's very much a funding mechanism. But it does have an article called Article 42.7. A lot has been said recently about that, and we need to make sure that there are pre-agreed protocols within 42.7 so that in the event of a military confrontation, the European Union countries, member states, are ready to commit certain assets, whether it's military assets, whether it's air defense, or for neutral countries that might be a problem, right? So maybe they can commit humanitarian aid. The thing that we don't want to have is for that decision to be made under fire. So pre-agreed protocols, we make sure that Article 42.7 is activated automatically and each ally knows what it is that they're committing to an operation in the case that that happens.
I mean, at the same time, this is the interesting area we go into. We talk about NATO, Article 5 being that really keystone about protection for the alliance. You mentioned also what's come up for the European Union, 42.7. The European Union edging more into defense as well, but more, some might say, industrial production. That's necessary, that's required. But this idea of always balancing these two, SACEUR, so basically the person in charge, the highest, you said operations and military command, that's still an American general, Grinkiewicz, right now, here in Europe. But at the same time, all these different levels, can it really be in parallel, or will there be overlap? Will that, let's say, cannibalize in some regard what NATO is structured to do, what the European wasn't structured to do? We've talked about this before, but where are we headed with this?
This is not about the European Union becoming a defense union that would then defend the continent. It's playing a second layer. I'm arguing that the #1 organization stays NATO. The problem is the capacity at 32 to do that. So it's thinking about a mutual defense not at 32, but amongst the countries, so a more regional approach amongst the countries that are within certain regional plans of NATO and therefore needs to be operational at that level. Then when the European Union comes into play is more the political legitimizer role through the activation of 42.7, so that nobody in Europe says, well, this is a regional war. We don't really care about the regional war. Let them fight it out. That's a massive problem, and this is where the EU's strength lies. It is the organization, the institution at 27 in practically the whole of Europe, covering north to south and east to west, that can make sure that through Article 42.7, which is a treaty-bound obligation for all countries to join in some way, and this is what needs to be specifically defined. But I'm not arguing for the European Union to create new forces that would defend the continent. That's the sort of duplication that you're talking about, which would be problematic. Of course, within this scheme, once we're developing it, there may be some duplication arising, but it's not an argument for the European Union to take over from NATO. NATO is still there. It's still functioning. It's rhetorically, it's a big problem, and it's a bit like Schrödinger's cat. We don't actually know whether the alliance in Article 5 will be there if we activate the plans because of the very strong stance of the United States right now. But the HQ is there, the operational plans are there, the joint force commands, which is more of the local level, there are 3 across Europe. The plans are there, and Europeans are committed to these plans. They're giving forces to these plans. The increased defense spending is going towards military kit, that is towards these plans. There's no need to make do with that.
Yeah, but at the same time, we have these two parallels, and you're saying, like, in terms of industrial capacity, military capacity, but also we have NATO, we have these two articles. There's a lot to discuss. I'm afraid we don't have the time for it, but it's always really fascinating to hear that and where we're going with this. We'll hear more at the Alliance Summit. Marta Prochwicz, thank you so much for joining us as always. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you for watching, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.